Hello there, and welcome to today's episode. Have you ever stood at the edge of opportunity, heart racing, palms sweating, only to take a step back because the fear of falling short was just too overwhelming? That paralyzing thought, what if I fail, has silenced more dreams, halted more innovations, and prevented more personal growth than perhaps any other mental barrier we face. I'm Dr. Olivia Bennett, and today we're diving deep into a universal human experience, the fear of failure, and more importantly, how to transform that fear into a foundation for resilience. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to know that if you've ever abandoned a goal because of the possibility of failure seemed too devastating, you're not alone. If you've ever played it safe rather than reaching for what you truly desire, you're in good company. And if you've ever felt that knot in your stomach when taking a risk, you're experiencing something profoundly human. But what if I told you that this very fear that holds you back could become the catalyst for your greatest achievements? Today, we're not just talking about overcoming fear, we're exploring how to fundamentally reshape your relationship with failure itself. We'll uncover why our brains are wired to avoid failure at all costs, how this evolutionary protection mechanism can become our greatest limitation, and most importantly, the practical evidence-based strategies that can transform your mindset from fragile to resilient. By the end of our time together, my hope is that you'll not only understand the architecture of your fear, but possess concrete tools to build a mind that sees failure not as an endpoint, but as a crucial stepping stone on the path to growth. So settle in, perhaps grab something to take notes with, because this conversation might just be the turning point in how you approach challenges, setbacks, and opportunities from this day forward. The journey from fear to resilience begins now. Let's start by understanding what's really happening in our minds when we contemplate the possibility of failure. Our relationship with failure isn't random, it's deeply rooted in both our evolutionary history and our personal experiences. From an evolutionary standpoint, failure once had much higher stakes. For our distant ancestors, failure could mean physical danger or exclusion from the tribe, which often meant death. Our brains developed sophisticated alert systems to avoid situations that might lead to these negative outcomes. When you feel that surge of anxiety at the thought of failure, you're experiencing an ancient survival mechanism that's trying to keep you safe. But this biological response doesn't exist in isolation. It's powerfully shaped by our experiences, particularly those from childhood and adolescence. Think back to the messages you received about failure as you were growing up. Were mistakes met with patience and guidance, or with criticism and disappointment? Did the adults in your life model resilience in the face of setbacks, or did they avoid risks and prioritize perfection? These early experiences form the template for how we process potential failure as adults. Society further compounds these influences. We live in a culture that celebrates success while often hiding the failures that preceded it. Social media platforms become highlight reels of achievements, creating the illusion that others succeed effortlessly while we alone struggle. Educational systems frequently reward correct answers rather than thoughtful attempts, inadvertently teaching that mistakes are shameful rather than instructive. These combined forces create what psychologists call failure avoidance, a tendency to organize our lives around preventing failure rather than pursuing growth. This avoidance manifests in patterns you might recognize in yourself. Procrastination often isn't about laziness, it's about postponing the possibility of failure. Perfectionism isn't really about excellence, it's about making failure impossible by setting an unattainable standard. Playing it safe by staying within your comfort zone isn't about contentment, it's about controlling your environment to minimize the risk of falling short. Even the habit of self-sabotage can be traced back to fear of failure. By ensuring failure yourself, you remove the uncertainty and maintain a sense of control. The price we pay for these protective behaviors is steep. When we organize our lives around avoiding failure, we significantly limit our potential for growth, innovation, and fulfillment. Think about it, every significant skill you've developed, from walking to your professional expertise, required numerous failures along the way. Imagine if you had given up after your first few wobbling attempts at walking as a toddler. Learning requires iteration, and iteration necessarily involves imperfect attempts. Beyond skill development, avoiding failure diminishes our resilience. Each time we successfully avoid a challenging situation, we temporarily reduce our anxiety, but we also reinforce the belief that we can handle failure. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle where our comfort zone gradually shrinks and our confidence in our ability to navigate setbacks diminishes. What begins as avoiding specific failures can evolve into a generalized sense that we are fundamentally incapable of bouncing back from difficulties. Perhaps most profoundly, chronically avoiding failure disconnects us from our deepest values and aspirations. Most meaningful pursuits, whether creating art, building relationships, advancing in a career, or making a difference in our communities, involve risk and inevitable setbacks. When fear of failure becomes our primary decision-making filter, we find ourselves living a life defined more by what we're avoiding than by what we're creating or contributing. Understanding these psychological underpinnings is crucial because it depersonalizes our fear. Rather than seeing ourselves as uniquely inadequate or cowardly, we can recognize that we're experiencing natural human responses shaped by biology, personal history, and cultural context. This recognition is the first step in developing a more constructive relationship with failure. But what exactly do we mean by a resilient mindset? It's not about eliminating the fear of failure. That fear is hardwired into our biology and serves important protective functions. Rather, a resilient mindset is characterized by the ability to feel the fear and move forward anyway, guided by your values rather than your anxieties. It's about developing the psychological flexibility to experience failure as feedback rather than as a referendum on your worth as a person. Let me share a personal example that illustrates this shift. Early in my career as a psychiatrist, I applied top resent research at a prestigious conference. I had worked tirelessly on my submission, and I was certain it would be accepted. When the rejection email arrived, I was devastated. I questioned my abilities, my career choice, and spent days avoiding my colleagues out of shame. This reaction, personalizing the failure, catastrophizing its meaning, and withdrawing from support exemplifies a fragile rather than resilient response. A year later, after working to develop greater resilience, I submitted to an even more selective conference. This time, when the rejection came, my response was markedly different. I felt the initial sting that's natural and unavoidable, but rather than spiraling into self-doubt, I reached out to colleagues for feedback on my submission. I identified specific ways to strengthen my research and presentation. I reflected on what I had learned from the process itself, regardless of the outcome. And most importantly, I recognized that this single rejection said nothing definitive about my worth or my future prospects. Thesis: what a resilient mindset looks like in action. The good news is that resilience isn't a fixed trait you either have or lack. It's a set of skills and perspectives that can be cultivated with practice. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the remainder of 4 conversation today: practical strategies for building the resilience to face failure, not as something to be avoided at all costs, but as an inevitable and valuable component of a meaningful life. Before we delve into those strategies, I want to invite you to reflect on your own relationship with failure. Can you identify areas of your life where fear of failure might be holding you back? What patterns, procrastination, perfectionism, playing it safe, do you recognize in yourself? And what might be possible for you if you could approach potential failure with greater resilience? Keep these questions in mind as we continue, as they'll help you personalize the strategies we're about to discuss. Now, let's explore the first crucial shift in building resilience: reframing failure itself. The way we interpret and make meaning from our failures fundamentally shapes their impact on us. Most of us have absorbed what psychologists call a fixed mindset perspective on failure, the belief that our abilities and intelligence are static traits, and that failure is evidence of our inherent limitations. Under this mindset, each failure feels like a revelation of our fundamental inadequacy, which naturally triggers intense emotional distress and avoidance. The alternative is what Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, the understanding that our capabilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. From this perspective, failure is not evidence of fixed limitations, but rather information about where we need to focus our efforts to improve. This isn't just positive thinking. Research consistently demonstrates that individuals who adopt a growth mindset show greater persistence in the face of setbacks and ultimately achieve more than those with a fixed mindset. So how do we practically shift toward this growth orientation? One powerful approach is to change the language we use to describe our failures. Instead of making absolute statements like "I failed" or "I'm a failure," try more specific and process-oriented language. "This approach didn't work," or "this attempt was unsuccessful." This subtle shift externalizes the failure, making it about the strategy rather than about you as a person. Similarly, practice adding the word "yet" to statements about your capabilities. "I haven't mastered this skill yet," or "I haven't found the right solution yet," reinforces that your current limitations are temporary way stations rather than permanent destinations. Over time, this linguistic practice reshapes your underlying beliefs about the nature of failure. Another powerful reframing involves viewing failures as data rather than as verdicts. When scientists conduct experiments, they don't view unexpected results as personal failures, but as valuable information that helps refine their understanding. Adopting this scientist mindset allows you to approach failures with curiosity rather than judgment. After a setback, ask yourself, what does this outcome tell me? What can I learn here that will improve my next attempt? This reframing process is particularly powerful when we can identify specific lessons from our failures. Research on expert performance across domains from music to sports to museness consistently shows that deliberate practice involving focused thrust and systematic efforts that leads to the highest level of achievement. Your failures, when mined for specific insights, provided the most valuable roadmap for this type of targeted improvement. Let me share a story that illustrates this principle in action. I worked with a client, a talented writer who'd received a harsh rejection from a publisher she deeply respected. Her initial reaction was to interpret this as evidence that she lacked talent and to consider abandoning her manuscript altogether. Through our work together, she gradually shifted to seeing the rejection as specific feedback about this particular project rather than a universal judgment of her abilities. She took the courage to request more detailed feedback from the editor who had rejected her work. While difficult to hear, this feedback contained precise information about weaknesses in her narrative structure and character development. Rather than using this information as further evidence of her inadequacy, she used it as a targeted guide for revision. She sought out resources specifically addressing these aspects of writing craft and applied them to her manuscript. A year later, not only was her revised manuscript accepted by another publisher, but she reflected that the quality of her writing had improved dramatically through this process. The rejection, though painful, had provided exactly the information she needed to elevate her work to the next level. This is the paradoxical gift of failure. When viewed through a growth mindset, it often contains precisely the guidance we need to succeed. Of course, reframing failure intellectually is necessary but not sufficient. We must also address the intense emotions that failure evokes, the shame, embarrassment, frustration, and disappointment that can overwhelm our rational understanding. This brings us to our second key strategy, developing emotional resilience around failure. When we experience failure, our emotional response often follows a predictable pattern. There's the initial shock or disappointment, which can manifest physically as tension, heaviness, or even a hollow feeling in the pit of your stomach. This may be followed by shame, that painful feeling that we are fundamentally flawed or inadequate. Anger might arise as a protective response, directed either at ourselves or externalized towards circumstances or other people. And beneath it all often lies fear that this failure predicts future failures, fear that others will judge us negatively, fear that we've permanently damaged our prospects or relationships. The natural human tendency is to avoid these difficult emotions, to distract ourselves, rationalize the failure, or quickly shift our attention to something else. But research in emotional regulation consistently shows that avoidance often amplifies negative emotions over time, while acceptance and processing lead to faster recovery and greater psychological flexibility. This brings us to a practice I call motion surfing, developing the capacity to ride the waves of difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. The first step is simply naming the emotions you're experiencing with specificity. Rather than vaguely noting, "I feel bad," identify precisely, "I'm feeling disappointed that my presentation didn't go as planned, embarrassed that my colleagues witnessed it, and anxious about how this might affect my standing on the team." This precise naming, which psychologists call emotional granularity, has been shown to reduce the intensity of negative emotions by activating the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for cognitive control. You're shifting from being submerged in the emotion to observing it with greater perspective. Next, practice physical awareness of how these emotions manifest in your body, the tightness in your chest, the tension in your shoulders, the churning in your stomach. Rather than trying to eliminate these sensations, simply observe them with curiosity. Notice their quality, intensity, and how they change moment to moment. This mindful awareness helps prevent emotional cascades where one difficult feeling triggers another and another in a downward spiral. Remember that emotions, no matter how intense, are temporary states rather than permanent conditions. Just as physical pain eventually subsides, emotional pain follows a similar pattern when we don't amplify it through avoidance or rumination. Many find it helpful to explicitly remind themselves, "This feeling is uncomfortable, but not dangerous, and it will pass with time." While processing emotions internally is important, research also clearly demonstrates the power of social connection in building emotional resilience. When we experience failure, our instinct is often to withdraw, to hide our perceived inadequacy from others. Yet sharing our experiences of failure with trusted others serves multiple purposes. It normalizes failure as a universal experience, provides perspective when we're caught in distorted thinking, and offers emotional validation that counters the shame response. I encourage you to identify resilience partners in your life, people with whom you can vulnerably share your experiences of failure and the emotions they trigger. The most supportive individuals will offer what psychologists call compassionate validation, acknowledging the difficulty of your experience without either minimizing it, "So, it's not a big deal," or catastrophizing it, "This is terrible." They help you hold your experience in perspective while still honoring its emotional impact. Self-compassion represents another crucial dimension of emotional resilience. Many of us speak to ourselves after failures in ways we would never speak to a friend or loved one experiencing the same situation. We use harsh, absolute language, "You're such an idiot," "You'll never get this right," that activates shame and undermines our capacity to learn and grow from the experience. Research Kristen Neff has demonstrated that self-compassion, treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would offer a good friend, predicts greater emotional resilience, more accurate self-perception, and more effective action after setbacks. It's not about making excuses or lowering standards. Rather, it's about creating the emotional safety necessary to honestly examine failures without being overwhelmed by self-criticism. To practice self-compassion after a failure, start by acknowledging the difficulty of your experience. Thesis really hard right now. Then connect to the universality of failure. Experiences like this are part of being human. Everyone faces setbacks. Finally, offer yourself the same kindness you would extend to a friend. "It makes sense that I'm feeling disappointed, and it's okay to take some time to process these feelings before figuring out my next steps." I worked with an executive client who exemplified this evolution in emotional resilience. When he first came to therapy, his response to professional setbacks was intense self-criticism, followed by frantic overworking to make up for his perceived inadequacies. This pattern left him exhausted and actually increased his error rate, creating a vicious cycle. Through our work together, he developed a new response pattern. After a significant error in a financial projection, rather than immediately launching into self-recrimination, he recognized his feelings of shame and disappointment. He took a brief walk to process these emotions instead of suppressing them. Hathan shared the mistake with a trusted colleague, which helped him realize that while the error was real, his catastrophic interpretation of its consequences was not. Most importantly, he spoke to himself with the same balanced perspective he would use with a team member who had made a similar mistake, acknowledging the error without questioning his entire professional competence. This self-compassionate approach allowed him to analyze what had gone wrong more accurately and develop specific safeguards to prevent similar errors in the future. Over time, this pattern became more natural, and he reported not only better professional outcomes, but significantly improved quality of life as the burden of perfectionism lightened. This integration of emotional and cognitive resilience leads us to our third key strategy: practical failure management techniques. While mindset shifts and emotional processing are foundational, specific behavioral practices help translate these internal changes into effective action when facing potential or actual failure. One powerful approach is what I call failure forecasting, systematically anticipating what might go wrong in a given endeavor before you begin. This might sound counterintuitive, as we often avoid thinking about potential failure for fear it will demoralize us. But research in fields from military planning to entrepreneurship shows that controlled exposure to potential failure scenarios actually increases confidence and improves performance. Try this exercise before your next challenging project. Take a few minutes to imagine different ways that project might falter or fail. For each scenario, ask yourself, what specifically would go wrong here? What early warning signs might indicate this problem is developing? What specific actions could I take if this occurred? Document these reflections, creating what military strategists call a premortem for your project. This process accomplishes several things. First, it desensitizes you to the fear of failure through controlled exposure. Second, it helps you identify preventative measures you can implement before problems occur. Third, it creates a contingency plan that reduces panic if things do go wrong. And finally, it builds confidence by demonstrating that even if the worst happens, you have resources and strategies to respond effectively. Another practical approach involves deliberately creating low-stakes failure opportunities. Much like exposure therapy for phobias, gradually and intentionally experiencing failure in controlled contexts builds your failure tolerance over time. This might involve taking a class in something you're not naturally good at, engaging in friendly competitions where losing is a real possibility, or setting stretch goals where partial success is a victory. The key is to approach these experiences as deliberate practice for building your failure resilience rather than as tests of your worth or ability. After each experience, reflect on what you're learning about your relationship with failure and how you might apply these insights to higher stakes situations in your life. A technique that pairs well with this approach is the failure resume, a document where you actually record and celebrate your failures, rejections, and setbacks alongside the specific growth or opportunities they eventually created. Unlike a traditional resume that showcases only successes, this document honors the crucial role that failures have played in your development. Reviewing and updating this document regularly reinforces the understanding that failure is not the opposite of success, but rather an integral component of it. Let's talk about practical strategies for the immediate aftermath of a significant failure, that critical period when your response can either amplify the negative impact or transform it into a growth opportunity. I recommend a structured reflection process using what I call the 4 R's of failure recovery. First, record the facts of what happened as objectively as possible, separating observable events from your interpretations or emotions about them. For example, my proposal was not selected, rather than my proposal was rejected because it wasn't good enough. Second, reflect on contributing factors, both those within your control and those beyond it. Avoid the extremes of blaming yourself entirely or placing all responsibility externally. Instead, aim for a balanced assessment. I could have researched the client's needs more thoroughly, though their budget constraints were also a significant factor. Third, retrieve the lessons. Identify specific insights you can apply to future situations. Make the action-oriented and forward-looking for future proposals. I'll schedule a preliminary call to better understand budget parameters before investing significant time in development. Finally, redirect your energy toward the next opportunity to apply these lessons. Failure tends to narrower focus. Deliberately broadening your perspective to identify new possibilities counteracts this tendency. I'll reach out to 3 other potential clients where my approach might be a better fit. While individual practices are valuable, organizational and community contexts significantly impact our relationship with failure. If you're in a leadership position, whether as a parent, educator, manager, or community organizer, you have a unique opportunity to foster environments where resilience can flourish. Research on psychological safety in teams shows that groups who can openly discuss mistakes without fear of punishment or humiliation consistently outperform those with low psychological safety. As a leader, explicitly communicating that well-intentioned failures are not just tolerated, but valued as learning opportunities sets the foundation for this safety. Modeling this by openly discussing your own failures and what you learn from them is particularly powerful, as it gives others permission to do the same. Consider implementing structured practices that normalize learning from failure, such as regular failure share sessions where team members discuss recent setbacks and insights gained. Some innovative organizations even celebrate Failure of the Month, highlighting instances where ambitious attempts didn't succeed but generated valuable learning for the entire organization. For parents and educators, research clearly shows that praising effort and strategy rather than innate ability helps children develop resilience. When a child succeeds, highlight the process. You worked really hard on that problem and tried different approaches until you found one that worked. When they experience setbacks, focus questions on learning and next steps. What did you learn from this that might help next time? This type of dialogue builds the growth mindset we discussed earlier from an early age. Now that we've explored these strategies conceptually, let's integrate them into a comprehensive resilience building practice you can implement in your daily life. I recommend starting with a resilience audit, an honest assessment of your current relationship with failure across different domains of your life. Ask yourself, where do I tend to avoid challenges for fear of failure? When I do experience setbacks, what are my typical emotional and behavioral responses? Who are the people in my life who support my resilience and who might unintentionally reinforce fear-based patterns? What past failures still carry an emotional charge for me, suggesting unprocessed experiences? Based on this audit, identify one specific area where building greater failure resilience would significantly enhance your life. Perhaps it's in your career, where fear of failure has kept you from pursuing advancement or taking on challenging projects. Maybe it's in creative pursuits where perfectionism has blocked expression. Or it could be in relationships where fear of rejection has limited vulnerability and connection. Within this focus area, commit to a specific resilience building action you'll take in the next week. This might be using the failure forecasting technique before an upcoming challenge, practicing self-compassionate language after a setback, or deliberately seeking a low-stakes opportunity to experience and process failure. The key is making your commitment specific and time-bound rather than remaining at the level of general intention. As you implement these practices, recognize that building resilience is not a linear process. You'll likely experience what appear to be setbacks in your resilience building journey itself, moments where old patterns reassert themselves despite your best intentions. Rather than interpreting these as evidence that you cannot change, view them as valuable data about the deeply ingrained nature of these patterns and the specific circumstances that activate them. Let me share a story from my own experience that illustrates this integration of strategies. Several years ago, I decided to expand my professional work to include public speaking, something well outside my comfort zone as someone who had always preferred one-on-one interactions. My first major speaking opportunity was at a conference where I would present to over 300 people, many of them leaders in my field. In preparing for this challenge, I used failure forecasting to identify specific ways the presentation might falter, technical problems with slides, forgetting key points, hostile questions from the audience, or simply freezing up from nervousness. For each scenario, I developed concrete contingency plans, which significantly reduced my anticipatory anxiety. I also identified a resilience partner, a colleague with extensive speaking experience who could provide both emotional support and practical guidance. Crucially, I shared my fears with this person rather than pretending confidence I didn't feel, which allowed for targeted coaching on the specific aspects of speaking that most concerned me. Despite this preparation, the actual presentation included some elements of failure. I spoke too quickly at times, skipped an important section when I lost my place, and struggled to concisely answer a complex question during the Q&A. My immediate emotional response included embarrassment and concern about how colleagues would perceive me. Rather than avoiding these feelings, I applied the emotion surfing technique, naming them specifically, noticing their physical manifestations, and allowing them to be present without judgment. I practiced compassionate language, acknowledging that public speaking was new territory for me and that imperfection was a natural part of the learning process. After the talk, I used the 4Rs process, recording what specifically had gone well and poorly, reflecting and contributing factors, retrieving key lessons about pacing and structure, and redirecting my energy by immediately accepting another speaking invitation where I could apply these insights. Perhaps most importantly, I added this experience to my failure resume, noting both the specific areas of struggle and the growth they generated. This wasn't just a mental exercise, I actually documented it in writing, which helped transform what might have been merely an uncomfortable memory into a concrete history of resilience in action. What I found most striking about this experience was how the integration of these various strategies created a resilience that was greater than the sum of its parts. The cognitive reframing made the emotional processing more effective. The practical contingency planning created space for self-compassion when things didn't go perfectly, and the documentation of lessons learned transformed a temporary failure into a stepping stone for future success. Over the years, I've repeatedly witnessed similar integrative approaches with clients, students, and colleagues. A young entrepreneur used failure forecasting to anticipate potential pitfalls in her business model, which allowed her to pivot quickly when market conditions changed. A student combined emotion surfing with self-compassion to transform his response to academic setbacks from withdrawal to constructive engagement. A team leader implemented regular failure share sessions that dramatically improved both innovation and morale among team members. What unites these diverse examples is the fundamental shift from seeing failure as something to be avoided at all costs to recognizing it as an inevitable and valuable component of any meaningful journey. This doesn't mean seeking failure for its own sake or being satisfied with preventable mistakes. Rather, it means understanding that a life without failure is necessarily a life without significant growth, meaningful risk, or substantial achievement. This understanding liberates us from the exhausting vigilance of trying to prevent all failure and redirects that energy toward building the resilience to fail well, to extract maximum learning, maintain self-worth, and continue moving forward in the face of inevitable setbacks. It's the difference between organizing your life around fear and organizing it around growth. As we move toward concluding our time together, I want to emphasize that building resilience is not just about personal achievement. It has profound implications for our collective well-being as well. Communities and organizations where failure is stigmatized tend to become risk-averse, hierarchical, and stagnant. In contrast, those that normalize learning from failure foster innovation, psychological safety, and adaptability. By developing your personal resilience, you contribute to this larger cultural shift. Each time you respond to a setback with curiosity rather than shame, you demonstrate an alternative approach for those around you. Each time you share what you've learned from a failure rather than hiding it, you help create space for others to do the same. In this way, your individual resilience practice becomes part of a broader movement toward more adaptive and human ways of working, learning, and relating. I invite you to consider resilience building as both a personal practice and a gift to your communities. The courage you show in facing your fears of failure creates permission for others to do the same. The compassion you extend to yourself in moments of setback expands your capacity to offer genuine compassion to others. And the growth you demonstrate through learning from failure inspires those around you to perceive their own challenges through a similar lens. As we bring our conversation to a close, I want to leave you with a reflection that has been meaningful in my own resilience journey. The fear of failure is ultimately about the future. We imagine potential negative outcomes and experience anxiety in the present moment because of these projections. But resilience is developed in the present through the choices we make about how to respond to what's actually happening right now. When you find yourself caught in fear of failure, gently bring your attention back to the present moment. Ask yourself, What small step can I take right now that aligns with my values, regardless of the eventual outcome? Often, the path through fear isn't about guaranteeing success, but about connecting with what matters to you and taking action from that place of meaning. Remember that resilience isn't about never falling, it's about developing the confidence that you can and will rise again when you do. Each time you face a fear, process a failure, or support someone else through their own challenges, you strengthen this fundamental trust in your capacity to navigate life's inevitable difficulties. I hope our exploration today has provided both insight and practical strategies for transforming your relationship with failure. Remember that this transformation isn't a destination, but a continuing journey of small choices, gradual shifts in perspective, and consistent practice. Be patient with yourself in this process, celebrating progress without expecting perfection. After all, even our efforts to build resilience will include their own instructive failures along the way. Thank you for engaging with these ideas so thoughtfully. I believe deeply in your capacity to build their resilience that will allow you not just to weather life's challenges, but to use them as catalysts for growth, connection, and meaning. The path from fear to resilience is walked one step at a time, and today you've taken important steps on that journey. I want to transition now to some frequently asked questions about resilience and failure that might address specific concerns you have as you implement these ideas in your life. These questions come from me work with clients, audiences at speaking engagements, and readers of my research, so they represent common challenges people face in this area. How can I distinguish between when I should persevere through failure and when I should change direction? This is one of the most nuanced aspects of resilience, discerning between productive persistence and stubborn attachment to an unworkable approach. Rather than making this decision from a place of emotional reactivity right after a failure, I recommend a structured assessment. First, examine whether the goal itself still aligns with your core values and priorities. Sometimes what we're pursuing made sense in the past, but no longer fits our current life direction. Second, evaluate whether you've truly implemented the lessons from previous failures or if you're repeating the same approach expecting different results. Third, consider whether external circumstances have changed in ways that fundamentally alter the feasibility of your goal. And finally, check whether pursuing this particular goal is creating such significant costs in other life domains that it's no longer worth the trade-offs. This balanced assessment helps ensure your resilience is serving your overall well-being rather than keeping you locked in unproductive struggle. What if my fear of failure is so strong that I can't even begin to implement these strategies? This is a valid concern. Sometimes our fear responses are so intense that they preclude engagement with every practices that would help us move forward. In these cases, I recommend starting with what psychologists call pendulation, briefly touching the edge of your fear and then returning to a sense of safety, gradually building your capacity to stay with discomfort. This might look like writing about your fear of failure for just 2 minutes before engaging in a calming activity, or imagining a minor failure scenario for a short time before consciously shifting to memories of past resilience. Over time, these brief exposures expand your window of tolerance, making it possible to engage more fully with resilience building practices. How do I handle the impact of my failures on others, especially when my mistakes affect people who depend on me? This question highlights an important dimension of resilience, its interpersonal context. When our failures affect others, acknowledging the impact with a clean, direct apology is the essential first step. This means taking responsibility without excessive self-criticism or defensive explanations. Next, involve those affected in your learning process by asking what would help repair any damage and prevent similar problems in the future. This collaborative approach often strengthens relationships rather than weakening them, as it demonstrates both accountability and commitment to growth. Finally, remember that modeling how to respond constructively to failure is one of the most valuable lessons you can offer to those who look to you for guidance, whether children, employees, students, or team members. What about systemic factors that contribute to failure? How do we balance personal resilience with addressing unfair conditions? This question points to a crucial limitation in resilience discourse that focuses solely on individual responses without acknowledging structural barriers and inequities. True resilience involves accurately assessing what aspects of a situation are within your control and what aspects require collective action or systemic change. When facing failures influenced by discrimination, economic inequality, or other systemic factors, personal resilience practices remain valuable for sustaining your well-being and effectiveness, but they should be complemented by connection with communities working towards systemic change. This balanced approach prevents both helpless resignation and exhausting over responsibility for conditions beyond individual control. How do I handle the fear that one significant failure will permanently damage my reputation or career? This concern often underlies intense fear of failure, particularly in professional contexts. While some failures do have substantial consequences, research on career trajectories shows that most people overestimate both the magnitude and duration of reputational impacts from isolated failures. Unless a failure involves ethical violations or demonstrates fundamental incompetence in your core function, most professional failures become substantially less relevant over time as you accumulate further experience and results. To counteract catastrophic thinking in this area, I recommend developing what psychologists call multiple contingent pathways, mentally mapping several different routes your career could take even if a specific failure occurs. This concrete planning reduces anxiety by demonstrating that alternative A's exist even in worst-case scenarios. What if I've tried to learn from failures but keep encountering the same problems? Recurring patterns of failure often indicate that we're missing something important in our learning process. Sometimes we're focused on surface behaviors without addressing underlying patterns of thinking or relating that driveth those behaviors. In other cases, we're learning intellectual lessons without developing the emotional regulation skills necessary to implement them in challenging situations. Working with a skilled therapist, coach, or mentor can be particularly valuable in these situations, as they can help identify blind spots in your current approach to learning from failure. Additionally, structured practices like keeping a detailed failure journal that records not just what happened, but your internal experience before, during, and after failures can reveal patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. How can I support someone else who's experiencing failure without minimizing their experience or reinforcing negative patterns? Supporting others through failure is an art that balances validation with perspective. Start by giving them space to express their experience without rushing to solutions or silver linings. Phrases like, "That sounds really difficult," or "I can understand why you'd feel discouraged," communicate that you're truly hearing them. Once they feel understood, asking open-ended questions about what aspects of the situation feel most challenging and what might help them move forward invites them to activate their own resilience rather than depending on your solutions. Finally, expressing specific confidence in their capabilities. "I've seen how creative you are in solving problems," rather than generic reassurance, reinforces their resilience while acknowledging the real challenge they're facing. How do I maintain resilience when facing multiple failures or setbacks in quick succession? This situation, which might be called failure fatigue, requires particular attention to resource management. When failures compound, basic self-care becomes not just supportive but essential. Ensuring adequate sleep, physical movement, nutrition, and social connection provides the physiological foundation for psychological resilience. It's also crucial to adjust expectations temporarily, potentially focusing on fewer priorities or extending timelines to create space for recovery. Finally, intentionally reconnecting with past successes and progress can counter the recency bias that makes current failures seem like the only reality. Reviewing your failure resume with attention to how past failures eventually led to growth can restore perspective when current challenges threaten to overwhelm your resilience resources. As we consider these nuanced questions, I'm reminded that resilience isn't a fixed destination, but a continuing practice that evolves as we encounter new challenges and develop greater self-knowledge. The strategies we've discussed today aren't one-time solutions, but rather tools to be implemented, refined, and adapted throughout your life. Each application deepens your capacity to face future failures with greater wisdom and equanimity. I'd like to conclude our exploration with a perspective that I've found particularly meaningful in my own journey with failure and resilience. When we fear failure, we're often imagining the pain of falling short, the disappointment, embarrassment, or setback that might occur. But equally worth considering is the pain of looking back on a life constrained by fear, the opportunities not taken, the growth not experienced, the contributions not made because the risk seemed too great. Viewed from this longer perspective, resilience becomes not just a protective factor, but a fundamental enabler of a fully lived life. It allows us to engage wholeheartedly with challenges that matter, to learn continuously from our inevitable missteps, and to maintain our sense of worth and agency even when outcomes don't match our hopes. It transforms failure from something to be avoided at all costs into rich territory for discovery, connection, and growth. Whatever challenges you're facing or contemplating right now, I hope this conversation has offered both practical strategies and a renewed perspective on your capacity to navigate them with resilience. Remember that building this capacity is itself a process that includes setbacks, moments where old patterns reassert themselves despite your best intentions. When this happens, you have a precious opportunity to practice self-compassion and to apply the very resilient strategies we've discussed. Toya resilience, building journey itself. You already possess the foundational capacity for resilience. It's an inherent human quality that has allowed our species to adapt and grow through countless challenges. The practices we've explored today simply help you access and strengthen this innate resource, gradually building confidence in your ability to not just survive, but learn and grow through life's inevitable failures and setbacks. As you move forward from our conversation today, I invite you to take one small step toward greater resilience, perhaps implementing one of the practices we've discussed in a specific area of your life where fear of failure has limited you. Remember that resilience, like any skill, develops through practice rather than perfection. Each time you face a fear, process a failure productively, or support someone else through their struggles, you strengthen neural pathways that make future resilience more accessible. Thank you for your presence and engagement throughout this exploration. If you found value in our discussion today, I'd be grateful if you'd consider sharing this episode with someone who might benefit from these ideas, subscribing to the podcast for future conversations on psychological well-being, or leaving a review to help others discover these resources. Your engagement helps create a community of practice around these important topics. Until next time, remember that each failure faced with courage and curiosity becomes not an endpoint but a stepping stone on your unique path of growth and contribution. The journey from fear to resiliency is walked one step at a time, and I believe deeply in your capacity to walk it with increasing wisdom, self-compassion, and effectiveness.